Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Steve Cannane. Coming up, the Afghanistan expert who says our troop deployment has done little to fight terrorism, why employers are struggling with the government's new award system, and the controversial ad that compares giving kids junk food to hooking them on heroin. Our panel tonight, Catherine Fox from the Australian Financial Review, James Carleton from Radio National Breakfast, and in Melbourne, James Paterson from The Spectator. First, a strong sense today of just how quickly the government plans to move on setting a carbon price. The new Minister for Climate Change says Australia needs that to happen as soon as possible. But Greg Combet has refused to confirm reports in today's Sydney Morning Herald that the government wants to legislate for a carbon price by late next year to avoid a coalition scare campaign.
Well, I can't answer that question. We need to do the work. I think at a political level, the debate demands that we do need to build greater understanding and consensus in the community to support a reform such as this. So long as Tony Abbott can exploit fear, run scare campaigns in order to oppose a reform that is in the national interests of this nature, that debate also needs to be carried out with the community to build support for the reform that's necessary. Ultimately, it's the level of support in the community, it's the strength of advocacy from the various interests in the economy, including from many in this audience, that is going to be very important in determining the timing. I can't sit here from a standpoint where we're in a minority government and going through this process where I can certainly indicate certainty about timing, other than the fact that the government is determined to make this reform.
The opposition leader has again accused Labor of dishonesty to the electorate over this issue.
I mean, she said the day before the election, I rule out a carbon tax, and she ruled out a carbon tax to try to win votes, and then to try to form a government, she ruled in a carbon tax, and that's why I say, Alan, this is a government which is fundamentally based on a lie.
James Carleton, the argument in Phil Corey's piece today in the Herald is that Labor needs to get this up and happening before the election, well before the election, so they can nullify any campaign against it. Is that how you see it likely to pan out?
I don't think it'll necessarily pan out that way, although on paper it is a very attractive option, isn't it? They remember the GST election where when we didn't know what the GST was, when we had fear of the unknown, well, it got Paul Keating re-elected. But then once the GST was implemented and Kim Beazley promised to roll it back, well, people realised that life wasn't really fundamentally that different to what it was before, and the scare didn't have quite the same impact. It may well be that a price on carbon, if implemented well before the election, would pan out the same way. But there's a difference now. There's a minority government. The Greens are at the table. They would need to tick off on any agreement. They didn't tick off on the position the government had when they held the whip hand, the majority in the House of Representatives before the last election. It's hard to see that they'll be keen to give up their bargaining chip now that they are in such a position of influence.
Catherine, is this the strategy you think Labor will take to try and get it up and happening, legislation before the Parliament with about a year to go before the election is due?
Well, I can see the logic in it. I think the words great big new tax are still ringing in our ears, and I think that therefore there is some logic around that timing. It is interesting, of course, that what's happened in the last few weeks is that a number of business leaders have come out and actually called for some certainty on this issue and actually said that a carbon tax was the way to go ahead. And I think that's really been quite pivotal. I mean, if you have the business community actually saying this is what we think needs to be looked at, I think that must have some impact on what the government does.
James Paterson, the coalition will be arguing that this is a broken promise by Labor. Do you think they'd rather they have about a year to argue that case, or do you think they'd rather they bring it to an election?
Well, Steve, I think it's interesting that Julia Gillard is looking to John Howard as an example of how to implement a reform. Of course, there's one missing element from the plan that was outlined in the Sydney Morning Herald today, and that is that John Howard took the GST to an election. After previously ruling out GST as an option, he said to the Australian people, I've changed my mind, the GST is an option, it's something we need, and he had the guts to take that option to the electorate, and he won an election on that basis. Now, that's the model for Julia Gillard. If she wants to introduce a carbon tax, the only honourable thing that she can do is to take it to an election, to promise the Australian people that she'll implement a carbon tax. Because at the last election, she promised that she would not implement a carbon tax. She said that there will be no carbon tax under any government she leads. So I think if this is going to be an honest and legitimate government, then it needs to take this issue to the Australian people at an election.
And James Carleton, it may not be a carbon tax, it may be an ETS. We don't know that yet. But do you think that Labor could find problems negotiating with the Greens? Because the Greens will probably want a price on carbon higher than what Labor probably wants.
Yeah, they certainly will. There's no doubt about that. And we saw, I think, in Greg Combay's remarks today, when he pointed out that the Greens need to lower their expectations, or words to that effect, you can clearly see him charting out the ground of what he will be trying to do on behalf of the government, which is literally weave through this narrow middle ground, if indeed it exists, where he can... I mean, we have to look. The Labor Party has come from a position where they wanted to lead the world on climate change under Kevin Rudd. Then they went to a position at the other extreme, where not only were they going to wait for a domestic Australian consensus, they were going to wait for an international consensus as well. And now we're getting back to what appears to be something of a more middle ground approach. But again, we have this complicating factor of the minority government status, and that means the man holding the aces is Bob Brown. Can you imagine the difficulty of Kevin Rudd implementing the mining tax or selling the mining tax if it was co-written by Bob Brown? Well, that's a situation we have now with ETS.
Well, we know it's definitely not going to happen before July the 1st, don't we? Because that's when the Senate changes. And, Catherine, we could see a return to the emissions trading scheme, because Greg Combay said today, while a potential carbon tax has received a lot of media and public commentary in recent times, it would be incorrect for people to assume that this is the market mechanism that will be inevitably selected.
Don't you think that's very much politicians speak for saying let's rule anything out at this stage? That sounded very much to me as don't pin me down. I think the ETS really has to be declared gone. I don't think. I mean, it got a lot of opposition from the environmental lobbyists and from scientists and so on. It was not seen as being, in fact, an ideal solution, and in fact the Greens, as we know, were anti the ETS. So look, from what I've been reading about this, and I'm no specialist, but my understanding is that the carbon tax has been viewed for some time as something that is viable and that could be got up. And I just suspect with the ETS and the legacy it's left, I think we've probably seen the end of that.
Well, the government is facing another potential battlefront with business over industrial relations. A report in today's Fin Review says Labor's streamlining of awards has caused confusion among employers, and complying with the system is wasting time and money. But the Prime Minister has defended the changes.
Can I say this question was canvassed extensively during the discussions that led to the Fair Work Act, and in that consultation, every employer organisation in this country argued for strict limits on arbitration.
Catherine, the Fin Review today, it's saying that the Workplace Ombudsman got 17,000 calls from separate businesses in 1 week recently. That's a lot. There seems like there's a lot of confusion out there about these new awards.
Yes, it certainly does. And it's interesting that it's occurring, or that we're getting reports about that now, because, of course, Fair Work came in at the beginning of the year. And it does sound as though there is genuine confusion. I'm sure that is the case. My little glimpse of this recently, because I write quite a lot about women in the workplace, was when I was at a forum and a group was asked if they knew about the right to request flexible work provisions, which are part of the Fair Work Act, which came in at the beginning of January. And about 3 people in the room put their hands up, and this was...
Out of how many?
Oh, there would have been about 50.
So why don't they know?
They were mainly women. So my point is, it's to their benefit to know. I think there were two things that came through to me. I don't think the government has done much, perhaps as much as it could, in communicating some of these provisions. And the second thing is that employers also seem to have done very little to make this known. It's interesting. I think there's various theories as to why that could be the case on that particular area. My understanding is that some employers fear there could be a stampede towards flexible work, and they're actually quite deliberately not making it one of their priorities. We don't really have much evidence that would be the case, because similar provisions exist in the UK, and that did not happen. But it is interesting that those provisions have been there, a big positive for those of us who are advocating change in that area, and yet so many people don't seem to know they're there.
James, are we just seeing teething problems here? The Workplace Ombudsman saying that, sure, this is complex, but he thinks that it will be a vast improvement on the previous award system.
Well, it's not a bad point. I mean, 122 awards are complex, but they're not nearly as complex as the 4,000 they're trying to replace. I mean, it's one national system replacing the 6 federal awards, and any change in industrial relations in a federated system will necessarily be inherently complex. And given that most of the lion's share of awards apply to small businesses, to the enterprises, least likely to have the time and wherewithal to be acquainted with these things. They don't have human resources departments.
Yeah, that's right.
Means they're necessarily going to be the ones who are most confused. So, look, these questions do come in, but no change is a way to stop confusion, and that wasn't really an option. The most simple industrial relations system is a law of the jungle, and again, that's not an option either. So, unfortunately, hard decisions have to be made in this field.
James Paterson, if business is having problems with these new awards, why isn't the coalition kicking up more of a stink about it?
Well, look, I think, Steve, the coalition was certainly burnt by the experience of work choices, and understandably there's some hesitation there. But I really do think there is a strong case for change with the industrial relations system. The reforms that Kevin Rudd enacted, and reforms is really a generous way of describing them, took this Australian industrial relations system back to the 1980s. It didn't just undo work choices or Howard's 1996 reforms, it even undid some aspects of the Hawke-Keating government's labour market reforms. So what we have now is a 21st century economy saddled with the 1980s industrial relations system. And I think describing the award modernisation process as modernisation is really an Orwellian use of the word. I mean, for instance, there are students who are being prevented from doing a 2-hour shift after they finish school at the local tuck shop because the Fair Work Minimum Award standards are that you have to do a 3-hour shift.
James, just on that point, didn't Access Economics say this awards modernisation process would save the economy about $4.8 billion?
There certainly are gains to be had from the award modernisation process, but it's important in doing so that it preserves the freedom of individuals to arrange an employment contract that suits them. My first job when I was at high school, 15 years old, was working at a $2 shop, and I used to walk down the street and do a 2-hour shift between 4 p.m. and 6 o'clock every night to earn a bit of pocket money and to learn some experience about what the workplace is like. Now, I don't see why I should have been prevented from doing that. I don't see why the $2 shop should have been prevented from employing me. My parents were happy with it. The only people who are unhappy with it is the union movement. And I think this is a really unfree and unfair system that prevents students from earning a bit of pocket money on the side.
James, I know you were at a HR Nichols Society dinner on Thursday night. Was there much talk about... I know there was, senior Liberal people at that dinner. Was there much talk there about the need to change Labor's Fair Work Act, because surely it's going against core Liberal beliefs?
Look, I think there are very many Liberals who have serious concerns about the party's position on industrial relations. I think there are many, both in the parliamentary and in the organisational ranks of the party, who would like to see the Liberal Party out there on the front foot advocating for industrial relations reform. We've seen today a 39% wage increase won by oil rig workers. That should send a shiver down the spines of all Australian businesses, and it should be the Liberal